Listen, I'm gonna need you to do some Gantt charts.
Gantt charts.
Yeah, I'm gonna need you to do a Gantt chart because we need to know what it takes to get, quote, all the work done.
Absolutely, yeah. I could give you a Gantt chart that the only thing it'll guarantee is things will happen on days that end in a Y. Other than that, I can't guarantee anything because,
Listen, I feel you got a bad attitude about doing Gantt charts for me, the Agile project manager. I put Agile in front of project manager. That means we're Agile.
That means
now.
I got to get you a Gantt chart faster.
That's right.
If I do a Gantt chart, will you please take this the right way? Will you hold it against me? Like, will you say, you said, something will be done by July 31st, and it's not?
Listen, it's like at the used car lot. You were the first person to throw a number out. So
I lose.
Yeah, you lose.
Yeah.
We're going to throw a number. Or whatever. We're the last. I don't even know how the rule works, but the point is, if you're in an organization, and they're traditionally a project management-led organization, because I don't know a better way to phrase that, then there's a high chance that you use Gantt charts in your organization, or at least at the leadership level they use Gantt. Maybe your team never sees a Gantt chart, but your leadership most certainly does. And every panel that you have at your organization that gives a thumbs up or thumbs down to projects before they start, because again, if you're using Gantt charts, high likelihood you're also using projects, right, to allocate funding to your software efforts. You probably have to create a Gantt chart, do a certain amount of planning, and do some activities like that before you're even allowed to start a project.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. I think a lot of times it stems from the powers that be looking for some sense of comfort. They look at that and they say, hey, if you give me a Gantt chart, it gives me something to put on a wall and talk to with my leadership. Okay, fine, but to your point, the leadership is planning with Gantt charts and the teams may not see them. So now you have a situation where the planning's done up front and the teams are supposedly delivering in an agile way. How does that marry up together? Yeah. I think expectations are a big thing here. So if leadership understand that the Gantt charts are done at a given point in time, so it's a snapshot, and it's likely to change. If they admit to those two things, and then the last thing you want them to kind of lent on is these are not guarantees. When I put those little diamonds on a Gantt chart, being milestones, they're best faith estimates. We think this might happen, this might not happen.
I mean, are they? Like, you bring us into the purpose of this episode. Like, it's Arguing Agile, how to argue about Gantt charts. Welcome to the new framing of the podcast. I changed all the taglines for all the podcasts across all the podcast platforms to say we argue about things in the Agile space so that you don't have to.
Right.
They changed that. And I feel like in an effort that follows that branding, I'm not going to put you in the position, I'll do it on your behalf, to be the one that argues for Gantt charts rather than against. I'm not going to put you through that trauma.
I don't mind. Honestly, don't. It wouldn't be the first time.
No, because if I were the one arguing against Gantt charts, I feel like I would make an equally crappy argument against them than for them. So I feel you should be the proper one making the argument against them. So that's how we'll go point by point, arguing for and against. We'll try to stick to that framework.
Sure. For
this podcast, and if we don't, then hey, you'll get all your money's worth out of the podcast.
Keep your receipt. That's right.
Yeah, keep your receipt. Turn it into your corporate HR or HR. So Gantt charts. What is a Gantt chart? Why does the industry use them? Let's start there.
That's an awesome question. A Gantt chart, for those that don't know, is really nothing more than a description in a visual format of when various components of your project are anticipated to complete. So let's say you're buying a car, for example. You might have a Gantt chart that says you're doing some research, you're looking up the different car manufacturers, models, etc. that suit your need. So there might be some bullet points that you can put down and say, by a certain time, I want those done.
All of your research, yeah. That's right. Everything. So yeah,
you'd put something down on paper, virtual paper, that says, if I'm done doing my research by a certain time, then I can go shopping for the car. And then you'd have another limit a time by which you should be finished with your shopping so you can actually start negotiating with car dealerships or wherever you're buying your cars from. And then finally you might have something on your Gantt chart that says you actually buy the car, you register it, and that's it. That's the end result. There's various different levels that you can break this down at, but these are just high level things that you might have in this example. So a Gantt chart is nothing more than a projection of anticipated high level activities, right, that are put down, and then you project out some end times for these activities. Along the way, you would have some key activities. They look like any other activity except for the fact that they're a point in time rather than a range. So starting my research, ending my research is a range of time. It's a time block. Whereas registering my car, it's not a range. I don't start registering now and then finish a few days later. I do it, right? So that's one day, a day on which you register your car. So that becomes what's known in the Gantt chart world as a milestone. And it's represented on this chart as just a little diamond, typically. You can have any shape. So that's really what a Gantt chart is. It's a forward-looking projection of when you anticipate activities to be completed. The last diamond in every Gantt chart that's the end of the project. So in software development, it's typically you're building a new product. It's a product launch or go live or however you want to phrase that.
Well, I've been on projects with Gantt charts that go into an aftercare, hypercare, whatever you want to call it, daycare.
You could definitely do that. I mean, maybe I should take that back. It's not the last milestone on your Gantt chart that says you went live. You might have a period of warranty, and you can put that on. And there's typically a fixed duration on that, maybe 3 months after the product is launched, that the development team is hand-holding the product.
Yeah, it's negotiated with your vendor usually if
absolutely.
You're contracting.
So you can do that. Right, exactly. And then in that example, right, the last one would be when you turn it over to perhaps another team within your organization that's handling that. Maybe it's an operations or maintenance or support. Yeah.
I wanted to go back on something you said, but I also forgot what we were talking about. Gantt charts is like looking at an auto accident where there's fatalities involved. I look at it with interest.
But you can't stop looking at it.
I can't stop looking at it, but also I'm like, oh God, why? I wanted to look at this topic from the perspective of companies that say that they're doing agile development, but still claim that they want Gantt charts. Because the two seem to be incompatible.
So I think that's a really good point. Maybe we can just step back a shade and just talk about where these things came from. Right? Gantt charts are named that way after the inventor of these things, right? Henry Gantt. Henry Gantt came up with this back in, a long time ago. So think about that time frame, early 20th century. There was hardly no software being written back then. So when Henry Gantt came up with this, it was to reflect processes that were completely predictable, right? For example, manufacturing is fairly predictable. And so he came up with it with the right intent to say, here's what we can plan. We can make a short-term plan this month, right? Medium term this month. At the end of this month, maybe, 3 months, 6 months out. Take your pick. And then the next level, you can do that. What he did not do is he did not build in the idea that, and this applies regardless of whether it was software or non-software. Basically, when he came up with it, it was, this is it. This is how you're going to do things. And if you didn't stick to the plan, you were off the plan. Yeah. So that's a bit of history behind where it came from.
Well, that would be, so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it's because Henry Gantt at that point was working as an understudy, or he was working alongside of Taylor at this point. And he was specifically studying the time clerk role of Taylor's operation. So he was dealing with a very small piece of the operation.
Right.
In the managing of the factory workers and the manual laborers, basically. Sorry, I forgot where I was going with that. But the point of me breaking in was to say, like, the management of how long it takes to do every individual task was just a smaller piece of all of this operation that was happening, all this professional management that was happening.
Right.
On this podcast, I'd like to be in the position of supporting one side of the discussion. I want to push myself to try to support the side of the Gantt chart. But also, I realize that the Gantt chart can't just live in isolation in and of itself if you're ignoring the management of all the other aspects. Because the idea is you've put in time to study how long it takes to do each individual job. And that the Gantt chart is built, Henry Gantt's time chart is built off of your expert understanding of how long it takes to do every single job. If you don't understand how long it takes to do every job, or you have not done the work to figure out the research to figure out how long it takes to do every job, you're not going to be able to build an appropriate Henry Gantt chart because you not put in the work to do the research. Which brings us to a very quintessential soul-searching problem of, can you build a Gantt chart for a task which is unknown to you? Can you include items in that Gantt chart that you're not sure, that you're not aware how long they truly are going to take? And I have to ask you, since I'm in the role of supporting, the deviations of the Gantt chart, the CPM, the PERT, the different types of charts that are out there that are deviations of Gantt charts, do any of those take into account what I'm talking about, where you're not exactly sure how long it takes?
So short answer is they absolutely do not. They do not take that into account. They only cater for the known. Gantt charts live in the world that is known. But I wanted to just briefly unpack what you just said, which is you have to be able to know exactly how long everything's going to take, right? And that's true if you're building a proper Gantt chart. The difficulty there is, how do you know? So you go and ask, right? You go and ask people. If you're not the expert who's actually building this, you ask people that do this for a living. Mm-hmm. So if you do that, you might get an answer. You might get many answers if you ask many people, and that's where I'm going with this. To have an activity completed, if you ask somebody who's been doing it for 20 years, 30 years, you'll get an answer. Call that A. Sure. You ask someone who's been doing it for 5 years, you'll get another answer, which is going to be different than A. Let's call that B. Sure. And you ask somebody who started last week, you're going to get C. Now, which is the right answer here? A, B, or C? And Henry Gantt, when he came up with it, originally, this whole concept of Gantt charts, he didn't build that in.
He didn't build that in, no.
Right. It evolved, however, over time.
They did scientific studies of people doing manual labor, and that's how they figured it out. They did a lot of studies. One tends to think, if I were to do a broad study of software development, and let's say, for example, your software development team was engaged in activities, and I could split your activities between two categories. The category number one is things that your team has a skill to do. Unless you're building web applications in React front end, C++ back end.
Yep.
Well-worn industry standard type of stuff. Right. I give you hey, we got to take our web application and we got to add these features. They're either C++ back end type features or they're React widgets for front end. And okay, well, it's all stuff that our team's worked on before. It's in the current code base, no problem. You probably could compare those features to things you've done before and come up with a good estimate of how long it would take. And then I would tell your team, okay, cool, that's great. Now I want to work with this completely new web application that you've never worked with before. Brand new code, brand new servers. The equivalent would be moving you from, like you work in the Azure cloud, and now I'm going to migrate my Azure cloud stuff, all the data, the application, the backend, everything, and I want to see if I can do this in AWS.
Right.
Completely different. So now your team has to go learn the whole AWS stack. The whole stack. They have to learn everything different.
Right.
All of the knowns where you could estimate, they all now break down. And you're in uncharted territory. So you have to have a period of time where you allow your team to learn new capabilities. The only reason I'm bringing this up is because now I'm in the vein of arguing for the Gantt chart. Is there a period of time I could give my team to learn something new? Say, hey, I'm going to give my team a month Like, because we as an organization have decided to migrate off of the Azure cloud. And it might not even be the Azure cloud. It might be that we are a .NET in-house shop with in-house servers.
Right.
We have a rack of servers in our data center. We're going to get rid of those servers in our data center. We're going to migrate up, and we've chosen AWS as a vendor. Okay, that's the situation I'm proposing now. Okay, so we're going to migrate out of an in-house architecture, and we're going to migrate to use the cloud. All AWS, everything. All gold all the time. Yeah, bling forever. So in my Gantt chart, I'm going to give a period of time to skill the team up to work in the new architecture.
Yeah, for sure. And that just becomes an activity on your Gantt chart.
It becomes a capability, training time, basically.
Correct.
It becomes training time on my Gantt chart.
It does. It really does. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think where this is kind of highlighting things is, in your example, there was a skill set that's needed, right, that needs to be procured on the team, so to speak. So yeah, you had that as an activity. When Henry Gantt came up with that, it was just literally just all these activities, one through N,
Right.
and various times when they should happen. And much later, it was, I forget the name. I don't even know if it was one person that came up with it, but the concept of dependencies was brought in. It's a natural evolution to looking at something like a Gantt chart to say, yes, we forecast this line. It's yay long. It was supposed to finish here, but down here we have something that cannot start until this is finished.
Sure.
So they linked the two up,
Sure.
right? And then
this is a great example, because you can't start your AWS development, your migration or whatever, until your team has the skills of operating in the AWS architecture.
Right.
So this is a great example. Your Gantt chart would stop at a point where your team has gained, quote, all the skills. I realize it's a bit unrealistic. Has gained all the skills, and then you can start your next phase of actually migrate my stuff to the AWS cloud, because now the team has all the skills they need. They've taken a 2-week period, 4-week period, whatever the period it is,
right,
to skill up in the environment and to learn things. So there you can't start section B until section A is complete. You can't start section C until sections B and A are complete. That is the typical Gantt chart that we think of. And like, not to introduce another term, but here we go. That would be the normal critical path of a Gantt chart. These are the absolute things that have to happen in order, and everything else is added on to that. But if these things don't happen, it's going to change the timeline for everything that comes before and after if these things don't happen as prescribed on the chart.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. I mean, the critical path is really showing you the shortest path to completion for the project, right? So anything that slides or delays, even if it's a short delay, will impact the critical path if that activity that's being delayed was on that path to begin with. Some activities are not on that path, right? Quite often. But yeah, so dependencies were brought into this model of creating a Gantt chart at that point. Yeah. And then later on, again, sometime later, they were evolved into different types of dependency. Like, this cannot start before this finishes, or this must start when this other thing starts, regardless of when they each finish.
Right, yeah.
Different types, right? Finish to finish, finish to start to start, etc.
Yeah.
All these different things came about. But for many decades, nothing changed fundamentally, right, around a Gantt chart. Much later, people realized that it's fine and dandy to have a Gantt chart. At least it gives you something, right? It's a plan, kind of makes people feel comfortable with the end date in mind that we might make it. Even though everybody recognizes that there's slim to none chance of nailing that date, but we might fall in the ballpark. Or that's what their hope is. So after many years, people realize that is really not prudent, because if you learn early on that you're not on track with that Gantt chart. So let's say, for example, you have activities A through Z, you're at C, and you already know that the planned C duration is going to be longer because something happened, whatever happened. It could be anything. It could be external things, a new regulation came out that you weren't expecting, whatever. Right? So it's going to take longer. Well, you know that everything's going to ripple out, and the end result will be longer, the end one. So why wait till the end and say, well, it's because of C? Why not adjust it now? That concept came into being. So people started saying, well, if you adjust it, we won't know where we started, right? Well, what was adjusted? over a period of time how many activities and by what amount.
Yeah.
So they started this concept of baselining. They would say, well, we'll just take a freeze frame of the first one we came up with that everybody agreed on. And that becomes what they call the baseline. And then anytime you change it going forward, other than just simply tracking progress against it, if you changed it, added something new, removed something, changed duration change of something else, whatever, these things were future snapshots again, right? They were saved. And sometimes people just did that, just keep them going. Change the plan as you go. Other times people said, we're going to have a new baseline now. So you change C and you go, okay, now given this, where are we now? That's our baseline.
Yeah.
Right? So that process is what in project management is named rebaselining.
Yeah.
So they did that. But beyond all of that, really not a lot has changed over the years. And I'm going to go back to your question. Right? You don't know what you don't know, basically. So how can you do that? For software development, that's a really good question because software development is not engineering. You're not stamping out widgets. When I say engineering, I mean it's like manufacturing. Predictable inputs, outputs, right? And predictable time to get from input to output. So if you think about a black box, which is the process, the input is what it is. The output, you know what to expect. All those three things are known. You can plot them on a chart. There's your Gantt chart. Inputs change in software development. Inputs here meaning requirements, right? They change. People find new things, etc. The process changes. Process meaning taking the inputs and turning them into outputs. That changes. Your team constituency changes. People leave, new people join. You go back to forming, everything that we know about. All that changes. And then the output itself, if you're really doing Agile, can change, right? So you set out at the beginning and say, this is what we want. And when you get closer to it, assuming that the stakeholders, the business has been involved throughout, they might say, well, this is taking time, but what we have now is good enough. We don't need that other stuff. That can happen in software. We don't need all that stuff now, so we can just deploy what we have.
Yeah, but what would you say to the person who claims the Gantt chart tracks my change cycle, and we might decide along the way that we want to pivot in an entirely different direction, and that's fine. We can update our Gantt chart, and our Gantt chart will change over time, and that is realistic, that our Gantt chart will change over time. But they'll have a mechanism that usually the mechanism, and like you've been a project manager, so I don't have to tell you, but the mechanism from my perspective is you go back in front of whatever team manages all the projects and all the, usually it's a team that has oversight over budget as well. You go back in front of that team and you say, hey, we've decided that we want to do XYZ, and XYZ is not the most advantageous of the market, so we're going to pivot to ABC, and we're going to cut the Gantt chart off here, and the old XYZ is going to stop here on this date. 1 week, 2 weeks, whatever from now, we're going to cut all the contractors, fire them all, get rid of them all, bring on a new team to do whatever, bring in a team from this other contractor, and then we'll start with Gantt chart ABC, and we'll go with these new priorities. The argument here is like, Gantt charts work fine. Like if you have to adjust, like you can just adjust them and change them, and they'll indicate new deliverables, and they'll basically indicate a new plan to the end, and it doesn't have to match what we started with. It doesn't have to match. Like we can show that we just changed the plan because that's the principle of agility now, and now we've taken the best of the project management world and the best of the Agile world, and we've blended them. Because we'll just throw out whatever Gantt chart we had before, and we'll create a new one, and that's cool.
Yep, absolutely, yeah.
That would be the arguing point here.
And that would be fair as an argument. I mean, there's some provisos there that you mentioned already. It's okay to change, right? When we have to pivot, we pivot. And if you're doing that, then a Gantt chart is fine to use as an instrument. Ultimately, though, you can look at that and say, well, how's your Gantt chart really any different than a product roadmap, as we know it in Agile? But most organizations, though, they tend to frown upon changes to a plan, changes to a Gantt chart. What do you mean? You have to, we're delayed now. We're suddenly in delay mode, right? Assuming you're not doing a hard pivot where everything changes, they understand that. But what we find is a plan, a Gantt chart is made up many months in advance of the desired end result. And any delays, any slippage is frowned upon. And that is completely non-Agile.
We've been talking about this topic now for a while, but we've not talked about how each individual little bar on the Gantt chart is created, because each individual bar in the Gantt chart could potentially be an individual team doing planning to tell the person who's compiling the Gantt chart. I was trying very hard not to say project manager. The person who's compiling the Gantt chart, to tell them how long they think, in their expert opinion, it would take to carry out whatever that bar is. So there's planning involved. But if you're trying to say, I want you to build a new software package, or a new software website, or mobile app. Let's go mobile app. We're in the business of knocking out widgets that we sell in the App Store for whatever, $2 for whatever people download them, right? The widgets do XYZ functionality, whatever it is.
Right.
I want you to create a new widget for my company that does XYZ, put it in the widget, and push it out to the store, right? You're going to build me a Gantt chart, and the Gantt chart's going to have milestones, and the milestones are going to say different functionality, and the very end is my app is in the App Store. It's people can download it and do X, Y, and Z functionality. X and Y and Z functionality. So you're going to have a Gantt chart that says build X functionality, build Y functionality, build Z functionality, push it out to the App Store, let customers download it, and do XYZ functionality.
Yeah, I mean, in that example, so if you've got each bar being represented by somebody who says, this is a team that's building this, etc., then what should really happen, as opposed to what actually happens, so let's just take it backwards. What actually happens is somebody just puts down their best effort. It might be based on their experience, or it might be just something they pull out of the air and say, this takes a month.
Who is, like, I got to stop you there, because this is my, if you're in the spirit of refuting, I have to stop you there because I need specifics.
Oh, I'll give you specifics.
We're going to assume that it's one team.
Okay.
It's a mobile app. It's one team. Okay. A couple iOS developer, Android developer, maybe 2 backend developers to support them. So it's one team. I want X functionality, Y functionality, Z functionality. There are 3 different features.
Right.
I want them all done before I push my app to the store for the customers, because that's what I've decided it is. MVP. Now, you and I both know. We're going to put that offline for a second. For the purposes of example, we know that MVP should not be X functionality, Y, Z, et cetera, et cetera. MVP is like, I made some screen designs. That's MVP. I pushed out in 4 hours. And here's my mobile app. The reason I bring that up is I want to make it more tactile, more real world for people that might be listening right now. That's why.
Yeah, so let's just go back, right? So it's one team, that's fine. You have 3, I'll call them features, whatever they are, right? Sure. As far as the Gantt chart, how does the estimate to complete each of these get reflected on the Gantt chart? So there's one of 2 different ways. Usually it's somebody uses expert judgment or just judgment, and it says, I've done this before with other teams. This kind of thing takes about this long. I'll add in my little padding to it, and so this is what I think it is. That's one way, and then they repeat for the other 2, A, B, and C. Start of A, finish of C. There's your product. The other way is you get the whole team together and you say, this is what we need to do. Go and figure out the how part. Let's get back together again in a few days, and as a team, with everybody's thoughts and inputs, and going back and forth and negotiation, etc., you would come up with a minimal path that gets you from A to C at the end. Mm-hmm. If I was the project manager or the Gantt creator of that process, I would then look at that and say, well, what are our assumptions that we're using here in building this? What are some of the risks? What are the dependencies that we haven't thought about that we might consider? Those things. So after you do that with your team at large, you would then add in all of those and say, it lands you at November sometime. And I'm not a big fan of actual dates, but let's say November. It falls in November. So my Gantt chart shows an actual date because all the software out there that does Gantt charts deals with absolute dates. Right. Yeah, you can roll that up and look at it in quarters or weeks or whatever, probably a good idea. And let's just say I looked at November. My messaging to stakeholders would be, we can get this done, assuming the assumptions that we have, here they are, we listed those for you, somewhere between November and January or whatever. It's always a range, right? And That is at this point in time with what we know. We will come back if there's any substantial changes to that. Yeah. If there's changes that take you from November to December, and you will know as you go forward that something's slipping, be upfront and say, look, that Gantt chart I shared with you, that needs to change, and here's why.
Yeah. Well, I need to ask some questions to make my argument a bit more solid.
Yeah.
If I'm trying to, as a project manager, if I'm trying to claim that my high-level planning ties to budget, that's really what this comes down to. I'm trying to tie it to budget. If I'm trying to claim that my high-level budgeting, basically, holds up to scrutiny, I need to know that all the planning that we did is all the planning that needs to happen. That's the issue here. Like I can't have my team go back into planning as the project goes deeper over time and as the project stretches out over time. And if you want to take this back to most people, like we're going to lose most people now. So thank you for listening to the podcast. But if I'm a project manager and I'm going to say, hey, we're done with the planning phase of this capitalized software budget, we're going into technical feasibility phase where we can capitalize the 100% of the developer's time or whatever.
Yep.
I need to know that I'm not going back. I'm not dipping back into planning phase. So in my chart, when we were in the next bar where it's 100% capitalized, whereas like we went through a couple weeks of deep planning with my tech leads and my architect, where the architect came down from the mountain and said, like, here is my architecture, plebes. Like, I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know.
You used to be an architect, I can tell.
Yeah. I cannot go back into a planning phase because then I have to alert my finance people and I got to go have a conversation with my CFO and say, oh, I said that we were not doing a planning phase, but we had to do more planning. The lean principle here for me, if I'm trying to completely pervert the Gantt chart and Agile, is the assembly line can never move backwards. The line only moves one direction.
Yep.
So the worst you could do is you can take something off the assembly line, call it waste, put it back on from the beginning.
Yeah.
That's the worst.
That's really the worst case.
You can't stop the line and move the whole line backwards. That's not in the model.
No, that's very, very true. I would say this, though. The concept that you've just outlined is very, very prevalent out there, right? Do all the planning up front. Indeed, they even call it the planning phase and the implementation phase or execution. Right. That seldom works, and I'll illustrate that with an analogy, right? Next time you're on a flight, just think about how that flight pans out. Let's say you're going from, I'll take a real example. Let's say you're going from, I don't know, LA to London. What happens? The flight takes off. Let's assume it takes off on time from LA and is going across the Midwest on its way. And if you're flight people, you'd understand the pilots are following what are called waypoints along the way. And you can follow the flight on a map, seat back, you can do that. And then you'll see that he's suddenly decided to go against the anticipated path, which is usually an arc. He's going against that. He's now going up to Canada. He's going to Halifax instead of going straight across the Atlantic. Why would he do that? And so where I'm going with this is the pilot didn't know himself when he or she set off from LA that that's the path they're going to have to take. They knew the start. They knew the destination. And because they've done this several times before, they knew roughly the kind of time frames it takes, right? And so they could say, well, we're going to land at this time. So when you take off, they'll say, we're flying at X thousand feet. Our flight duration is going to be blah, right? They'll say that. But on the way, if they're deviating from the plan, it's because of external factors that they just learned en route. They learned there's bad weather, for example. They learned that the president's plane is flying in the vicinity, so they were told to steer away. These are real. They happen all the time. They learned there's just simply too much traffic, as it's called, right? Too much traffic. So they're told, hey, deviate up here or reduce to a lower altitude, etc. These things happen all the time. Mm-hmm. And what do the pilots do? They don't sit there and update a plan. They simply respond to the plan by agreeing to ATC and doing what they're asked to do. And eventually they'll get to London, and they might get there at the same time. They might not. And if they don't, you can't say you got here late.
We call that collaborating.
Right.
Yeah, they collaborate with the other
Right.
pilots in the area, also with air traffic control. We call that collaborating.
Right, exactly. So my point of that analogy is, did they get you to your destination safe and sound? That's the first and foremost requirement. And now you could say they did, but 20 minutes late. It's like, okay, so what? Right? There's nothing you can do about that as it happened. So I think coming back to Gantt charts, we need to treat them in that way, right? So to your point about planning, here's what I would do if I were that project manager who had planning as a phase. I would have that in, but I would call that initial planning. And then I would have planning built into every phase.
Yeah.
And that's for the purpose of making those deviations, course corrections on the way.
I want to pivot now to the case against Gantt charts. What we started with in our intro in Agile, like obviously the first one is don't do a Gantt chart, okay? But Brian's sassiness aside, and that's a huge aside, by the way, let's talk about the case against Gantt chart. If somebody told you, hey, we're a Agile company and we do Agile software development, but I had somebody in my company, leadership maybe, right, saying, hey, I need a Gantt chart. I don't know how to tell when things are going to be done. If I don't have a Gantt chart, you need to do a Gantt chart. What would your initial reaction be? How would you deal with that? How would you deal with that person, probably in leadership, telling you that? What would your first impulse be before we go into the case against Gantt charts?
Well, as a lean Agilist, my first impulse is, yuck, what a waste, because ultimately, this is not adding value.
Yeah,
but that notwithstanding, let's just go back.
Obviously, my first reaction as well would be like, Gantt chart, that doesn't really help anyone.
No, but I mean, given the fact that you're being asked by leadership to do something like this, I think what I would do is this. I would say, look at the granularity at which you will provide such a thing. Because when you think about what your teams are doing, they're doing sprints, right? 1 to 4 weeks, possibly 2. Mm-hmm. And during the sprints, it's the team that picks up enough work that they feel they can finish in the sprint. And sometimes work doesn't get finished for whatever reason. So my point is, where would your Gantt chart, like what level are you doing your Gantt chart at? Are you doing that at the sprint level? And you say, in this sprint, we'll do this. In this sprint, we'll do this. Or are you saying it's every X sprint? Because if you're doing it at the sprint level, you'll always be updating that thing over and over and over. And worse than that, you would always be trying to justify that to leadership, that to say, you said it would be done. Why isn't it done? Right. So what I would do is I would have a conversation with leadership and set their expectation that the Gantt chart is a best faith estimate at a higher level, probably nothing lower than a month, that says, here are the features that we anticipate delivering. And milestones, not just features, but things like we'll start the process of launching the product. We'll start whatever the activities are. Put that in there. And the milestones, this is going to be slightly deviant thinking here for those of you that have done Gantt charts before. My milestones would not be a point in time milestone. It wouldn't say, let's say go live is April 15th or whatever. Right. It would have that milestone of April 15th with a dotted line that goes all the way out to potentially June 15th, because we're just starting the project, so my window's 2 months wide, right? And the messaging to leadership is, at this point, with what we know, we think we can land in that spot, somewhere between April and June. And as time passes, we learn more. That may change. It may get narrower. We may go from April to June to April to May eventually, and we may just stop there. And whenever it falls within that span is where it falls, and that's still a success.
Well, hang on a second. This doesn't sound much like the case against Gantt charts. This just sounds like how to incorporate it in your Agile project. I tend to think, if you're telling me how long does it take to do the entire XYZ project, I kind of feel I would be remiss if I didn't say, wait a minute, we don't even know if XYZ are all the features that the customers want.
You're right. And
to go back to that level.
I missed the prompt altogether here. The case against Gantt charts is the biggest one, is the obvious one, which is people fixate on the dates on the Gantt chart, and then they become commitments immediately. That's the case against it. Is these are not commitments. If you don't understand that, you shouldn't be doing Gantt charts. That's what I would say. That's the first thing.
I mean, the other thing is that this assumes that everything
Dude, it assumes more. It not only is assumed that everything that's going to happen, it also assumes all the dependencies are known up front,
Yeah.
right? Which you don't know. It's the stuff you don't know. It's the unknown unknowns. So what do? You put in a big old fudge factor, right? So we can go live anywhere between February and November. That's too wide of a fudge factor.
Yeah, well, as a product person, I don't like padding. Like I'll add the padding if necessary. Padding in the way of these are the other initiatives that the team is involved in that are more important than this. And we could go offline because we're engaged in XYZ. I'll engage leadership from the perspective of, don't you think these other things are more important? Leave that stuff to me. I don't need the team to add a third on top of their estimate and to pad things down because they know that I'll pad things down anyway, so the padded estimates are actually padded. I don't need all that. I need clean estimates, as clean as possible, because I'm going to try to align them around the expectation of scope. That's what I'm going to align on is, hey, can you deliver the ability to do feature X with this customer? Yes, I can, but feature X to me sounds like number 1 and number 2, not number 3, 4, 5. So if we're just talking about number 1 and 2, yes, we can deliver feature X. And that's what we'll rally around. And I don't need to talk to sales VP, customer advocate, representative, support rep, whatever. I will talk to the customer who asked for that feature, and I will show them every 2 weeks that we're done what we've done until they are satisfied. And we'll keep working on that until either until they're satisfied or until I get new marching orders from the higher ups in the organization, because at some point I'm tying into the company vision, which brings a product vision, which brings the features, which brings et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so that product-centric view and approach that you outlined absolutely has merit. I mean, that's valid. Getting raw estimates or absolute estimates without any padding and then doing your own thing with them, that's fine. But before you do that, should those estimates include things like a variance for people being out sick? I mean, I know we got whacked sideways when COVID hit, but even now with reinfections and everything, people take time off at the drop of a hat. No plan, right? So there's a certain amount of flex, I would say, that needs to be added.
Well, let's argue that. I feel like I'm effectively arguing the Gantt chart side of things. You should know how much sick time your employees have. You should know how much vacation time your employees have in aggregate. So if my employees typically have 30 days of vacation per calendar year plus X amount of sick days, 7 days, I don't know, 7 days. So my employees typically have 5 weeks of vacation. And I have, this is actually, this is a good number. My employees typically have 5 weeks of vacation for the whole year. And I have 6 people on my team, right? That means I should plan 2.5 days, because it's 6 people, 12 months, whatever.
Yeah.
I should plan 2.5 days. Out of every single sprint I have, 2.5 days I don't have productivity for. So if I'm trying to do a Gantt chart, you shouldn't be planning for 100% utilization. That's where I'm trying to go. Utilization, capacity, whatever you want to call it. You should not be planning for 100% because you're never going. That's not realistic.
No, you're right. I mean, so you've outlined the known knowns, right? I mean, we know people have PTO, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
It's the unknown unknowns, right? We don't know how many people are going to get off sick. Like, if they go, do they only take 3 days of sick time that they have allocated for their year? Or are they really out for 2 weeks for COVID? I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that as well. So that becomes non-scientific at that point. But the example you cited, you could definitely factor that in. And you should.
Yeah.
You should factor that in.
Yeah, but it should be generally factored in, because when, like what you just said, when you have one sprint where like, oh, well, this sprint, it's the, I don't know, 4th of July weekend, Christmas, New Year's break or whatever, like you should pretty much expect, like, you might have 1 or 2 people on your team that want to work in that, like, whatever, single people or whatever that might want to work in that. The rest of your team, you're going to have 3/4 people out during that period.
Yeah.
I feel there is a certain point of this where you should expect, there should be some familiarity based on your experience that you should expect dips, and spikes and dips. But I feel if you're planning for your normal amount of vacation away, whatever time in your calendar, you can make up for the spikes and dips moving things around. Okay, well, I'm expecting 3 days of vacation between the whole team in this 2-week period. This sprint, I had 0 vacation. Then the next sprint, I had 6 hours of vacation. They should make up for each other. Likewise, 4 sprints out over each other, you should make up for whatever variances you have in the longer term.
It comes out in the wash. I agree with you, right? But those things you can actually account for. What you can't account for is things like once the project started, you had people leave, new people join.
Yeah, right.
But having said that, let's say you don't account for that. That's still something you should really explain, right? Pointing to the Gantt chart and tell whoever's looking at it,
right.
And listen, we had this dip because of, right? And we all know what happens when someone leaves.
Yeah, the same way I feel about that, I feel about product management. Is, for example, if I'm tracking business value on all my stories, and I show in the last 2 sprints we had a significant dip in business value delivered over time, I, as a product manager, would come to the product management meeting, and my leadership would say, hey, Brian, how come these last 2 sprints you've done third to a half of what the normal business value has been? Like, normally you deliver 20 points of business value per sprint. These last 2 sprints you've delivered 8 and 10. What's going on? Why is there so low amount of business value compared to the normal? And I will say, well, because we've had a couple of technical upgrades that we've delayed, and we've had a few architectural things that have come up that we've delayed, and we really need to take some time and get over these architectural hurdles to get ahead, to get current with the technology, and we've dedicated a lot more time to making sure the team can bring the architecture up to speed so that we aren't bothered with end of lives and stuff like that. Like I'm fine explaining. It should be a 1-sentence explanation, and then we move on to our next topic. It should be that quick.
Right.
It should prompt the business to talk about it. I bring it up, I tell them the reason, and then we move on quickly. If somebody really wants to dig into did you have to do a migration now and not 3 months from now or whatever? If somebody really wants to battle that out, okay, you really want to get into a technical discussion in a product meeting, okay, we can do that. Let me you think of like a director of development or a CTO or somebody like that. If you really want, I will get them on the call and they will make the case, assuming I, the product person, cannot make the case.
Right.
Like maybe I'm in an organization where your product people are straight out of college or whatever. What we talked about a lot on the podcast, like your product people don't really know very much about technology. Then cool, you get your technology person on the call and they can explain what the risk would be if we did not overcome this hurdle.
Yep.
And they can help you talk through it. The topic we were going into was the case against Gantt charts. So to transition into doing a Gantt chart versus doing what you normally see in Agile development or Agile delivery or Scrum, where you have release maps, story maps, roadmaps, burn down charts. You have a lot of the different ways of measuring what the teams are up to.
Different artifacts.
And forecasting or measuring.
Yep.
So for me, again, in a product capacity, if I'm going to compare whatever the equivalent of a Gantt chart would be to what I would try to do is I would compare a Gantt chart to a roadmap. That's what I would compare, number one, if I had to do anything. Assuming I had to do anything.
Right.
So talk to me about how a Gantt chart and a roadmap are different, because if you look at the two of them on paper, they look very similar.
They do. They do look very similar. And I do agree, by the way, that it's not one or the other.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes people say that. I think fundamentally it's about the granularity. Gantt charts typically are not high level. People want to see the details in a Gantt chart. A roadmap can be high level. You don't necessarily want to see every inch stone on the roadmap.
Yeah.
There are tools that allow you to derive one from the other. So, for example, if you had a reasonable product roadmap, as you traverse down that roadmap, you can then derive a Gantt chart without having manually create it.
Sure.
The specific tools do a better job of that than others. Most ALM tools do not. There are extensions that you can use for that, but they really don't because they're sprint focused largely. Things like feature plans and things like that in tools such as Azure DevOps, for instance, they let you do a feature plan, but it's flat, meaning per feature A, this is your plan, feature B, it's not showing any dependencies, it's not showing any phases, anything like that. You could feed all of those kinds of things as work items on a one-on-one or roll-up basis into something like AHA, for example, right? And having done that, it works really well. So that people in AHA, the leadership, can see a Gantt chart, because it's nothing more than a series of bars at a higher level that are fed from your ALM, and they will see progress on it. I usually ask them to bookmark it and refresh it every time they feel the itch to look at it. So that's the difference. It's the granularity. Yeah. That's the first thing I would say. And the other thing, I've already mentioned it before, which is a product roadmap does not allow you to see dependencies across different things in that roadmap.
I would agree with that. On a roadmap, I would expect we are calling out features of the application. And when we're calling out features, as we implement each feature, we're deciding when enough is enough for the feature.
Yes.
Whereas a Gantt chart, I think the difference here for people listening who might be like, oh, a roadmap with a list of features is basically the same as a Gantt chart. It looks the same on paper. It's a bar that says when we started and a bar that says when we ended. The difference is when my customer is satisfied and when my product manager has kind of negotiated the end, that could come up to I guess it could come up to the sprint they're doing it in. I mean, it's flexible. It's very flexible.
Yeah.
The argument here is the Gantt chart may be equally flexible. We may be going to the customer at the end of every period of the Gantt chart and saying, like, hey, is this enough? Do you require more? You know?
It can be. I haven't seen that very often, but it can be. You're right.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Because of the nature of Gantt charts being planned so far in advance, everything being planned in advance, like, you probably wouldn't get that. You would say, well, you're done when the plan says that you're done because you've implemented everything.
Yeah, that, and also the fact that it's so onerous to keep a Gantt chart updated throughout. I'd rather see the focus. I know we're deviating from the topic at hand, which is the case against Gantt charts. Well, maybe if you flip it around.
You're in the right podcast.
Yeah, if you flip it around, though, it's why not have a Gantt chart? Because the Gantt chart does not have a product focus. It does not, to your point, say to the end user, is this enough? Yeah. Right? And they may turn around and say, yeah, we said we wanted this other thing. We don't want it, or we don't need it, or we don't need it now. So we can use it as is, and we'll see if we need it. So we need it later. It might be another project, a different budget, or whatever. Gantt chart has none of that, right? It simply has, we expect this to happen at a certain point in time.
Yeah. If you think about a story map, like when you draw, like my epics are here, I don't remember. My epics are on rows and my stories are in columns, and you draw a circle around. I can't remember, like I'm not doing this justice, but you know what I'm talking about. You draw a circle around whatever, and you're saying, okay, this is release 1, and you draw a circle around a certain stories that may span epics. You say, well, this is release 2. Isn't that the same as a Gantt chart?
Well, when you're doing that, right? Two things happen. When you're doing that, you're saying these stories that I've circled, we want that in a release. Is there a date with that release at that point on your roadmap? That's the question. Sometimes there is. Sometimes you say, well, at the end of sprint 12, we'll hope to get there.
Just for the arguing perspective of people listening, trying to support Agile, if there is a date, they probably are not dates picked out of the air. They probably are real dates.
Okay.
They're probably like, I have a team on site at this date, or my budgeting runs out at this date, or whatever. They're probably real dates based on real activities, not just like my salesperson promised XYZ functionality in 8 weeks from now. It's probably not a made up date like that. It's probably a date that actually has something like, we'll do as much as we can to support the privacy regulation that was passed by the federal government by XYZ date.
Good examples, yeah. So there could be dates for real reasons. Other than that, though, right? If you have those, great. We'll work with those. If you don't have them, there's flexibility involved through negotiation as far as when that release could happen. And it could go down several paths. It could be that as a product person, you could say, well, we anticipated a release with these 6 stories or whatever it is. And we see that the team ran into some headwinds with this one story, right? You know what? We'll take those other 5 and we'll still go with that release. Or we'll put that release on hold, right, until that 6th story is completed. In a Gantt chart, you really don't have that focus. You really only have a time-based focus. Yeah. And that, I think, is a detriment here, because outside of the sphere of influence, if you like, of the team, at a higher level perhaps, or external, I would say external to be safe, or leadership certainly, or to be more accurate and pedantic, it's management, not so much leadership. And they would look at that and say, on your Gantt chart, you were supposed to be done by this date. Why is that not done, right? So it becomes an inquisition at that stage. And then when you go into the organizations that use Gantt charts in this way, typically have monthly stage gate meetings. And you go into a stage gate meeting and you feel like all eyes are on you because you have to explain why what happened and it feels pretty uncomfortable, to be honest.
Well, even in product, you have to explain why things are changing.
Well, I meant defend, not so much explain.
I understand what you mean, but again, I'm trying to draw. I'm arguing on the side of Gantt charts.
Sure.
So that even in the organization where you are dealing with typical all the playing up front Gantt charts versus dealing with customer sprint to sprint, like I would think that you could say in this spread of the Gantt chart, I'm working with customer A. And the next spread of the Gantt chart, I'm working with customer B, and we're going to get as much done for customer A in this part of the chart as possible before we move to the next bar of the chart and deal with customer B. Like in that perspective, you're sort of being agile in that you are restricting your effort to everything you can do for a certain persona before you move to the next persona. So you can envision a Gantt chart from the perspective, if the bar on the chart is what customer are we serving in what time frame, then we could kind of argue back and forth about, like, is that enough time? How do you know enough time to please a customer? The back and forth of that is like, if you only give 2 weeks for customer C before you go on to customer D who gets 6 weeks, hey, is that really fair? Like, which is the more important customer? I guess you could do it with money. Which customer pays more, right? There are certain ways you can try to adopt this model. I'm kind of arguing all over the place. When you do a Gantt chart, I think you do it from the perspective of this is a complete plan from the very, very, very start to the very, very, very end, so that we feel that we're in control of the whole process. I think that's why we probably should have started the podcast with, that's why you do a Gantt chart in the very, very, very first place. So you feel you have a good understanding, and by understanding, I mean control of the whole process you're about to endeavor on.
Yeah, that's a valid reason why a lot of organizations use Gantt charts. Yeah. I think the other thing is, if you were to ask 10 organizations why you use Gantt charts, I don't know, maybe 7, 8 out of 10 might say, because that's what you do. That's how you plan projects. In other words, this is how we know how to do things. Right. Because people that are in that level of management, leadership, if you're being gracious, go up with this approach of big requirements up front, right? Full planning up front. That's all they know. So that's why they want you to create Gantt charts. And how do you move them away from that? That's a podcast in itself, probably. Yeah, but right. I think one thing that might help you is to not say no, obviously, right? But do a Gantt chart and get a commitment that these are not something that are guarantees. These are just, they're going to move. And don't position it as, these milestones I'm showing you and these durations of these activities, they might move. No, they will move, because nobody can guarantee when something will start and when it will finish. Yeah. So
I wonder if there's labels you can apply when things move. For example, emergence of architecture, emergence of regulations, emergence of priority, business priorities, emergence of different needs, technical needs, team needs, whatever it is. So when you go into your big quarterly or monthly or whatever big meeting, you can say like, well, we've had to change the Gantt chart again, assuming you can't change your organization to be more accepting of emergent changes to your prioritization process,
right,
and that you're stuck with Gantt charts. Organizationally, you're stuck with Gantt. I think that's probably the main reason we're talking about this topic.
Yeah.
To try to shift us from drive back into neutral for a second. Gantt charts, they're not really roadmaps. I could see where an organization could liken them to roadmaps. It's like, well, you start process A, you finish process A. You start process B, you finish process. It looks just like a roadmap. And it kind of does. Honestly, It kind of does look like a roadmap if you think about roadmaps from that perspective. But when you start thinking about roadmaps less as build functionality A and then build functionality B, and you start thinking about your roadmap from the perspective of solve customer problem A and solve customer problem B, the Gantt chart starts falling apart.
Very quickly, yeah.
Very quickly.
Customer-centric focus and Gantt charts do not mix.
Yeah, you start having big problems, and I would expect that your organization, again, if it's built from the perspective of the Gantt chart, your organization will start having internal conflict and falling apart at the same time. The other thing I wanted to go into that we didn't talk about in this podcast was the idea of systems thinking, because your Gantt chart, if it's only dealing with a very specific thing in the software, and it's not looking at your entire organizational and or systemic ecosystem when dealing with how we're going to deal with changes, it's going to fall short.
Yeah, so this is a relatively new, it's not a relatively new concept. It's a relatively new application of the concept of systems thinking in planning. It's been used at a short-term plan level before, quite extensively probably, but planning it for the whole initiative that an organization is taking on and using systems thinking is still in its infancy, probably. At least from what I've read. I might be wrong, and if I'm wrong, let us know in the comments. But I haven't seen that very widely applied. What I have seen is say at a team level, people can go in and start applying those principles because they are solid principles. In that, I don't even like the term micro-planning because it has negative connotation. But yeah, that's where I've seen it used. I haven't seen it used at a higher level. It's probably a good idea, though, if you're coming in at a level where you're influencing the organization beyond just software development. Yeah, I'm kind of torn because if you haven't shown them the value of it, you wouldn't get buy-in. So you have to show them value in some way, and then you might get buy-in, and you could take it forward from there.
Well, I think I wanted to talk about Gantt charts versus burn down charts, because the equivalency there is, you said in the Gantt chart would be, you said you were going to be done on this date and you're not, or you are, or whatever. And the burn down chart would be, you said that you could be done with 24 points worth of functionality on X date, and I calculated in my Gantt chart 24 points was these 2 or 3 features, and then you could be done. You know what I mean? The Gantt chart versus burn down, like you if you're going to equate a false equivalency on paper, this is another one where I could see you equating the two.
For sure. It's one of the fallacies in doing that is you knowing what that rate's going to be. So your team's going to burn down X number of story points over these many days.
Right.
That's not known. That's not necessarily known. You can look at heuristics and say, historically they've done that. But that's with those requirements. These are not the same.
I mean, so, I'll bring my product bent focus to this one. Is, let's say we're tracking business value and we're tracking velocity, right? Your work items have both. They might both be stable sprint over sprint. You might generally do about the same amount sprint over sprint. I mean, that would be the best scenario here. But should you manage deadlines, that kind of stuff? Like,
let's use an analogy for that specific scenario here, right? So you're running a marathon, 26 miles typically, I think, right? So 26 miles, and you're tracking how many steps you're taking, I don't know, every hour or whatever it is, right?
Every mile.
Every mile. Every mile. So the first time when you set off from the opening, like the pistol, you're gung-ho or you're not, depending on how you're pacing yourself.
You just hit it. Like you just hit both the values in one track. So you're tracking the number of steps, the amount of time it took you for the mile, and you're tracking the number of miles total. You're tracking every value you're tracking now.
Right.
So here we go. Like
Yeah, so how would that work out? Mile over mile over mile. And does that then project out in a linear fashion to when you're going to finish the marathon?
It doesn't.
Well, the Kenyans have proven it doesn't.
I already know it doesn't. Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, look, that analogy was just really just to point out the fallacy of all this.
Which one of those is your Gantt chart built off of? Is it built off of your steps? Is it built off of your time to miles? Or is it built off of your miles? Like, regardless of which, I feel we're transitioning to the case against Gantt charts again.
Yeah, we are.
Trying to summarize the topic. Because your Gantt chart could be published off of the number of steps.
Sure.
Your Gantt chart could be published off of the number of miles, which could be short. I mean, if you're in a 5K, 3 miles, and then, Gantt chart's over. Right. Or your Gantt chart could be on the number of steps. Which shell game are you going to play?
That's exactly
with
right.
With your Gantt chart.
Yeah, because these professional runners, they I don't want to use the word manipulate. They will vary up all these things, including their stride length, things like that, right? Based on a number of variables, based on the weather, based on what the competition's doing, based on whether it's a hill, uphill, or downhill, based on how they're feeling. That piece is completely out from our discussion.
Also,
gut feel.
Also, based on how close they are to the finish line.
Of course, right?
Because everyone sprints.
Sure.
Regardless how tired they are. When they see the finish line, everyone sprints to the finish line.
That's right. That's very true. That's very true. Some people leave more in the tank than others, right? But yeah. So leaving just this kind of gut feel factor out of it, too many variables in this, right? So multivariate analysis maybe. But even that assumes linearity. And that is what's different in developing software is you seldom have it. You really don't have it. And you don't have it even if the team is the same, but it's a different application you're building because you're learning and you're discovering new things all along.
As you build things and you learn things, you're going to be changing, I don't know, your estimate. I don't even want to say your estimate.
Your projection is probably a better way to go.
Yeah, like your forecast. Forecast, that's another way to say it. I think the summary for both of us is like, don't do Gantt. Like, Gantt charts are ridiculous. Don't do Gantt charts. Like that.
That's a good summary. Don't do them because they're.
I mean, like, okay, you're going to do them. Let's talk about how you're going to do them. Are you going to pick the number of steps to run your marathon? Are you going to pick the miles to run your marathon? If you're going to pick miles in Gantt chart, okay, are we going to use miles for everything else? Like, well, how many miles does it take you to learn a new technology? How are you going to represent that? Even if we break the 3 different things down to say the effectiveness of your solution, the efficiency of your solution, and just the bulk time of your solution. If we're to break them down to that, like you basically have to pick one to represent your chart. Okay?
Yeah.
Even when I do my backlogs as a product person, the team has its story points, estimates, man hours, actual hours, literally whatever they want. No hours, whatever. Every story is a 1, right? Whatever they want to do. That's for the team. For me, the product manager, I have my business value. That's an arbitrary number I set of how valuable I think it is. We both have our own arbitrary which one are you, the project manager, going to pick?
What an awesome question, right? So again, falling back on the analogy, if it doesn't matter which one you pick, as long as it's the consistency there, right? As long as it's the same one. To your point, if you're using business value in points, there's some quantification of that. Yeah. If you're using business value on whatever scale, if you're always using that business value delivered per month, whatever, that might be a metric you could share. Mm-hmm. And you could put that on a chart and you can call it whatever you like. Yeah. That's okay, right? I think that's okay as long as people understand this is not a guarantee. It's really backward looking because you're saying over the last 6 months we've delivered this or 2 months, whatever. Therefore, projecting forward, we can deliver the same. That throws away the idea that we're discovering something new so that it might not be the same. That's an understood assumption or built-in caveat, if you like. But there is one reason to do a Gantt chart, but don't spend a whole lot of time on it. And that just, you could use software to do it, and most software allows you to do this. Once you've done this, I suggest you completely throw it away. And that reason is this: if you know the activities you have to do, And if you know roughly how long it's going to take, it's a guess. But let's say you put the guess down. Most software, Microsoft Project, for instance, and others, they let you create what they call a network diagram out of this. Without getting too pedantic, what it will do is it will give you the critical path. In that critical path, and don't look at the numbers here, just look at the path and say, according to this, F has to be done before B, otherwise the whole thing slides. Just that knowledge alone is worth doing a Gantt chart if you were forced to do one. That's the reason to do one, and then throw it away. I'm not saying that knowledge cannot be gained another way. This is the quickest way. Throw things in there, put some times on, very quickly, find out your critical path. And now that you know that, you can adjust your backlogs accordingly and then just throw away your Gantt chart.
I don't know. I feel it's just a lot of overhead for me that I honestly don't need, because 2 sprints in, I could decide that the business values something else more, and I could throw away all of that planning that we had to do for XYZ or whatever. If your team is doing Scrum, there's a certain percentage of overhead with regard to the model of Scrum, which includes backlog refinements. If I decide to pivot and I have to do significantly more backlog refinement, am I breaking that number? I feel like I am, because I'm throwing out a bunch of previous planning that we did. I feel this was a helpful discussion from the perspective of, do I understand what people looking for Gantt charts are looking for? The people looking for Gantt charts are looking for a plan of everything end to end, every potential feature we ever could deliver. And I, as a product person, I could decide at a whim. It's not really.
It's more
at my expert investigation and opinion. But honestly, at a whim, I could decide, like, we're just not going to put any more money into whatever initiative, and we're going to pivot and do something else. So I really don't see a reason to plan more than 2 or 3 sprints ahead at the absolute most. Or if I'm planning 2 or 3 sprints ahead, I'm planning 2 or 3 sprints ahead from a very high level feature level. We're going to deal with the functionality X. And you as leadership might say, what does functionality X mean? And then I would rattle off 3 or 4 features that may be included in functionality X.
Right.
But when we get closer, I reserve the right to take stories in and out of functionality X as we talk to the customer. Like if you work in Azure DevOps, right, and you have epics, and those epics have features, and those features have stories, we'll break it down to that level. You might start with, here's an epic. Deal with this business problem. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to implement feature X. And inside of feature X, we're going to do story 1, story 2, story 3, story 4. That's what we planned. We talk to the customer. We get started. We do story 1. Customer likes it. We do story 2. Customer really likes it. Is very happy. We do story 3. Customer's like, this is great. Feature 4, 5, 6. I don't really care about them.
Yeah.
I got mounting pressures from other teams. I decide, you know what? I'm just going to cut feature 4, 5, 6. I'm going to cut them out of that feature. I'm going to move them to a future thing when I come back to that customer or when they give me money or whatever. And I just decide, I call the audible, and I just decide we've done enough for this moment in time where this feature is done for now.
Right.
And I make the call. As opposed to 6 months ago, we decided we were going to do 6 stories under feature whatever, A, X, whatever I said.
Yep.
And now, since we made the call 6 months ago, we have to stick to what we said.
Yeah.
You know, again, if some project manager who, again, wasn't even talking to the customer in the first place, decided that stuff months ago with a team who may have been contractors who aren't even here at the company anymore, and now I have to do it with my team or whatever. No. We're not going to plan that way. We're not going to operate that way. We don't need that. I will talk to the customer. I will sync up with them, and we'll do what it takes until they reach a certain level of satisfaction, and then we'll pivot and we'll go to something else. I, as a product manager, will take on that responsibility rather than delegate it to some outside person whose total job is not actually accountable or responsible for any actual implementation of the customer needs.
No, I couldn't agree more. I could not agree more with what you've just said. Big requirements, big planning up front really seldom works. And the only way they make it work is that person whose full-time job it is to keep planning and updating the plan is to re-baseline, re-base. And then a month before they go, this is our go-live date, and then turn around and say, see, I told you.
That person's full-time job is to manage us, manage all of the people that are responsible, talking to the customer, doing the actual work, all the people accountable and responsible for the work. They're just, their job is just to manage us. I don't see that as a necessity. We can self-manage.
Sure.
We can self-organize. We can talk directly to the customer, and to take it to the next level, to completely divorce myself from the point that I was supposed to be supporting at this point, we can talk to leadership as well, and other members of the organization, sales, right. Whoever else that we need to talk to, account management, whoever we need to align with, to say, this is what we're doing to satisfy the customer. This is what we're doing to deepen our relationship. This is what we're doing to solve their problems. And we can align that. We don't need a professional manager.
We absolutely don't. And I think Agile leadership understand that. Unfortunately, they're a rare species. Even today, it's surprising. Even today, you don't see too many of them.
Yeah.
But so the bottom line is, don't bother with Gantt charts.
Yeah. I think that's where we ended. I tried to support the side of the Gantt chart pretty fairly through 3/4 of the podcast, and I just couldn't.
It was pretty good attempt, valiant attempt.
Couldn't help myself anymore.
It was good.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, if you like this podcast, we appreciate all the likes. I probably already have stopped the editing at this point.
Yeah, I know. That's cool.
Gantt chart. Don't do them.
Can't even spell Gantt most of the time.